Imagine a war where the ocean itself is a battlefield. Silent, black, and unforgiving. Now imagine a submarine crew staring at the coastline of enemy territory and deciding that torpedoes and ships aren't enough anymore. They want something stranger. They want something the enemy won't even believe is possible. They want to attack a train. On land. Deep in the logic of a naval war, where submarines are supposed to stay underwater and stay unseen. And yet, in the summer of 1945, a U.S. submarine named USS Barb did exactly that. 8 sailors went ashore at night, planted a bomb beneath railroad tracks, and destroyed a moving train. An act so unusual that it's frequently described as the only U.S. ground combat operation on Japan's main home islands during World War II. This is the story of the submarine that sank a train, USS Barb. Officially, USS Barb SS-220 was a Gato-class diesel-electric submarine with one of the most celebrated combat records of the entire U.S. submarine force in World War II. Over 12 war patrols, Barb was officially credited with sinking 17 enemy vessels totaling 96,628 tons, including the Japanese aircraft carrier Unyo. But for all of that tonnage and all of those torpedo attacks, the moment that turned Barb into pure legend wasn't a ship at all. It was a railroad train. The absurdity is part of what makes this story so powerful. Submarines hunt ships, not locomotives. Yet in Barb's final patrol, the crew pushed the boundaries of what a submarine could do and what naval warfare could mean. To understand why a submarine would even consider a land raid, you need to understand where the war stood in 1945. Japan's supply lines were strained, merchant shipping. The lifeblood of an island nation at war had been badly mauled. Submarines like Barb were a major reason why. But that success created a new reality. Fewer ships meant fewer targets. For an aggressive commander, the problem wasn't fear. It was opportunity. How do you keep inflicting damage when the enemy adapts, hides, or simply runs out of ships to sink? That is where USS Barb's commanding officer, Eugene B. Fluckey, comes into the story like a character written for a thriller. Bold, inventive, and willing to gamble if the payoff felt worth it. Fluckey had already proven that he would take risks other commanders wouldn't. On Barb's previous patrol, the submarine executed a daring nighttime surface attack against Japanese vessels in shallow waters. A mission credited with earning Fluckey the Medal of Honor and the crew a Presidential Unit citation. That wasn't luck. That was a mindset. When the usual rules don't create victory, rewrite the rules. So when Barb returned to the Pacific for its 12th and final war patrol, Fluckey wanted something that would shock the enemy, confuse their assumptions, and prove that even the coastline wasn't safe. On that final patrol, Barb operated along the Sea of Okhotsk and the coastlines near Karafuto, known today as Sakhalin. During this period, Barb also made history by successfully employing rockets against shore targets, striking locations including Sherry and Hokkaido and several sites in Karafuto. That alone was unusual. Submarine-launched rocket attacks were not the typical image of undersea warfare. But rockets were still offshore. A train was different. A train meant stepping onto enemy soil, even briefly, even secretly. It meant turning sailors into saboteurs. And it meant placing human lives on the land side of the war in a way submarines almost never did. The idea reportedly crystallized when Fluckey and his crew noticed trains moving along the countryside, likely transporting supplies and troops. According to Military.com's account, Fluckey remarked, "Now there's a target I would like to blow up," and that casual statement became the spark for a plan no one had executed before. The crew began studying maps and rail lines, looking for a way to make the impossible practical. If the train carried supplies to ports or moved equipment toward defensive positions, then it was more than steel and wheels. It was part of Japan's wartime bloodstream. But the hardest part wasn't deciding to do it. The hardest part was engineering the how. Tracks run everywhere. There were no convenient bridges to blow, no obvious choke points. And unlike a ship at sea, a train doesn't wait. If you plan an explosive, you need timing. You need a trigger. You need a reliable detonation method that won't require a sailor to be standing close when the train arrives. Because that sailor would likely die. This is where one crew member's civilian experience changed everything. Electrician's mate third-class Bill Hatfield, who had worked for the railroad, proposed a solution built on a simple truth: rails flex. When a heavy train passes, the steel sags slightly. Hatfield suggested using that movement to activate a microswitch, turning the train into the mechanism that would trigger its own destruction. The bomb itself was another piece of desperate creativity. Military.com describes how Hatfield and chief of the boat Paul Golden Swish Saunders assembled a roughly 55-pound explosive device using a scuttling charge, wired to batteries, and packaged into something as mundane as a container, creating what Saunders called a land torpedo. The name matters because it captures how the crew thought. They were adapting naval instincts to a land target, translating submarine logic into sabotage logic. The weapon wasn't the hardest part. Getting it in place on time without being seen was. Then came selection. Who goes ashore? Flucky insisted on men who were physically fit, mentally steady, and capable of surviving the worst case. Being left behind, the team would be split into 2 4-man groups. There would be guards for the boats, sentries watching for patrols, and a small working group digging beneath rails in enemy territory. Wikipedia lists the raid participants, including Saunders, Hatfield, and Lieutenant William M. Walker, among others. These were not commandos by training. They were submariners. Yet for one night, they would become something else. The only Americans on that coastline, operating by stealth, not firepower. The night of the raid, July 22nd, 1945, arrived with the kind of tension that feels unreal until you realize what's at stake. Barb moved close to shore, so close that the margin for error nearly vanished. USS Nautilus.org describes how Barb came within about 950 yards of the shoreline, and after midnight the raiding party slipped into small rubber boats and began rowing toward land. Think about what that means. No armor, no backup, no air cover, no quick extraction if something goes wrong. Just darkness, discipline, and a plan held together by wire, batteries, and nerve. They landed quietly, moving through reeds and scrub. According to USS Nautilus.org, the team discovered that a structure they'd noticed, a water tower, was actually a lookout post. Even that detail changes the whole mood. It's one thing to imagine empty wilderness. It's another to realize an enemy observer might be above you watching. But luck held. The men established guard positions, and the working team began digging beneath the railroad track to create space for the explosive and the trigger mechanism. Every motion had to be controlled. A loud clink of metal, a careless flashlight beam, a cough. Any of it could have ended the mission instantly. And then the nightmare moment arrived early. A train came unexpectedly while the team was still working. Military.com describes a near miss that forced the men to flatten themselves and hide as the locomotive thundered past. Imagine the sound in the dark. The vibration in the ground, the metal screaming on rails, the instinct to run, and the need to remain invisible. When the train passed, the team returned to the tracks and worked faster. Now the clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. Because if one train could appear without warning, another could do the same. Finally, the bomb was set. The micro switch was positioned to be activated by the sagging rail under the weight of the train. The men began pulling back toward the shore in their rubber boats, but even their escape had a timer. According to military.com, Flucky warned the raiders they had only a limited window before Barb would leave because remaining near shore increased the risk of detection. And then, in one of the most cinematic details in the entire story, Flucky reportedly shouted through a megaphone, "Paddle like the devil, we're leaving." Not later, not soon. Now. The submarine was not going to die waiting for them. Out in the water, the men rowed hard, desperately, back toward the shape of Barb in the dark. Barb itself crept even closer, reportedly within about 600 yards of shore, a distance that sounds small until you picture shallow water, the risk of running aground, and the constant fear of patrol craft or coastal observation. This was naval warfare at knife range. And then the moment of payoff arrived. The train hit the switch. The charge detonated. Military.com quotes Flucky's later description of the blast. Wreckage flying high into the air and cars piling into a twisted mass of debris. A locomotive had been destroyed not by aircraft, not by artillery, but by a submarine crew that had briefly become a sabotage team on enemy soil. The symbolic impact of the raid is part of why it still gets told. Wikipedia notes that Barb's battle flag includes a train symbol commemorating the mission. That detail matters because it shows how the crew saw the raid, not as a footnote, but as a signature achievement. It was unique enough to be stitched into their identity, and according to Wikipedia's framing, it stands as the only ground combat operation on Japan's main home islands. A claim that has helped cement it in popular memory, even though the geography and home islands language can be debated depending on definitions. Finally, step back and ask the bigger question, why does this story matter? Not because one train decided the war, but because it shows how warfare evolves when bold people challenge assumptions. A submarine launching rockets at shore targets, then landing a raiding party to destroy a train, foreshadows the modern idea of submarines as platforms for more than torpedoes. Platforms that can project power, strike land targets, and shape the enemy's psychology. Naval Gazing notes how the Japanese initially struggled to interpret what had happened, and confusion itself is a form of pressure in war. If the enemy can't understand the attack, they can't reliably defend against it. End here with the human element. 8 men in rubber boats, a bomb built from a scuttling charge, and a plan powered by one sailor's memory of how rails flex under weight. For a few minutes in July 1945, A submarine crew stepped into history on a strip of enemy coastline and proved that even a train could be a naval target, if the imagination behind the mission was strong enough. If you want more stories like this, real missions where tactics, psychology, and engineering collide. Subscribe and tell me in the comments, what do you think was the most dangerous moment? Landing on shore, planting the charge, or escaping back to Barb while time ran out?